She's a Ukrainian American author, a speaker, a management consultant. She was born in Rochester, New York, to first generation Americans from Ukraine. With all of the news coming up right now about Ukraine, this is a conversation that I think a lot of people really need to hear. Oksana Kukurudza, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Amanda, so much for having me on your podcast. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I love you and I love your story, and you're just amazing. So I'm thrilled to have you.
I'm thrilled to be here.
We had quite a chat even before jumping into the episode.
We did.
Lots of laughs, pretty serious topics, but I think this is going to be a lot of fun. So let's talk a little bit about, you're originally from New York. My dad's from upstate New York originally also.
Really? Where is he from?
I know that my grandfather's street was named after him, and it was Sherman Way. Not far from Rochester. I think my dad went to school in Rochester.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Yeah. So, Amanda, I was born and bred in Rochester, New York, and did everything from primary school through high school in Rochester. And as you and I were speaking about earlier, I am the youngest of 12 children. And we're all Ukrainian Americans. 6 of us were born and raised in the US from my Ukrainian parents. The other 6 were born in Germany after World War II and immigrated with my parents to Rochester, New York, where they were able to find a sponsor to help them integrate into the United States and our society.
Wow. And your parents had an insane life.
Yes.
That's just kind of one way of summing that up. Yeah.
Yeah, it was traumatic times and it was a very traumatic life.
Right.
They were both born in little villages in Western Ukraine in a region that is called Galicia. But the oblast today would be, my mom was born in the Lvivska Oblast and my father in the Ternopilska Oblast. And at the time of their birth in the 20s, that part of Ukraine was part of the Republic of Poland. And they both grew up with hard times, very poor, but they were bootstrappers and they were able to pull themselves up. But everyone knows, at the time when they were in their late teens, that's when World War II started. And so it first started for them in 1939 when the Soviets pulled into Eastern Poland, and Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union partitioned Poland for themselves. And so that was the first time that my parents experienced communism in the Soviets. And my mother lost her brother, her older brother, whom she loved very much, to the Soviet invasion when he was forcibly conscripted. So that was her first traumatic moment in life, other than losing her mother at a very young age to pneumonia. Yeah, exactly. And she never heard from him again, which is, kind of a sad story to start with. And then in 1941, that's when Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union. And that part or that region then of the Soviet Union became a part of Nazi Germany. And then more trauma happened because the Germans it's a large country, but it doesn't have, an indefinite large population to pull from. They needed all of the active men for military service. And so they realized that they needed Eastern workers. And because the Nazis, I hope many of your listeners know this, but the Nazis were racist and they had a master race theory by which they put the Aryans, which was anyone who had Germanic blood. So Germans, Nordics, Western Europeans were at the top of their hierarchy. And then they had, many people know at the bottom were the Jews and the Roma and the homosexuals that were considered non-human and only good for extermination. And then in the middle class, which I believe a lot of people don't know this, the middle part of this hierarchy were the Slavs and Eastern Europeans, which basically made up the Baltics, Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union. And Slavs were considered to be subhuman and only good for slave labor. And so the Germans, soon after the start of the war in 39, they were already forcibly taking people from Western Europe and from other occupied territories to work in Germany so they could continue to fuel the war, because they needed people to farm the land, to build the bombs, to produce what was needed for the German economy and the German war to keep it going while the men were off fighting. And so they started out by using propaganda tools to recruit people in the occupied territories. And they used posters. They went to churches and, told the priests, what wonderful job opportunities there were. They had all of these propaganda posters and notices. And my mother ended up going to Germany to work because she believed the propaganda and the posters. My father, on the other hand, he was forcibly deported because people were also kidnapped. So if the propaganda didn't work, you were just taken off the street and forced to go to Germany to work. And then when people started to realize that no one was coming home from working in Germany, less people were volunteering. And so more kidnappings were happening.
Mm.
And when the people came to Germany, the way that they were treated very much depended on the hierarchy of the master race. And so for Western Europeans, even though they were forcibly conscripted to be laborers, they were treated close to Germans, and they were, paid a decent salary. Whereas Slavic labor, especially coming from the Soviet Union and Poland, they had to wear patches. So Poles had to wear a P on their clothing at all times, very similar to the Star of David, right?
Right.
That we've heard of from the concentration and extermination camps. And then if you came from the Soviet Union, as my parents did, then they had to wear an OST, which stands for Ostarbeiter, which means Eastern worker. And people were treated differently based on not wearing a patch or having a patch to wear. And the Eastern workers, or the Ostarbeiters, were treated the worst. They made barely no salary at all. And they lived in very harsh conditions and in camps that were guarded. And when I've seen examples of those camps, they look a little bit better than maybe a concentration camp. And they weren't fed very well. They weren't clothed very well. So it was a very difficult living situation for many of them. Some others had better situations. If they were able to work in someone's home, they might be treated better. Or if they were working on a farm, they might at least have access to better food, more food, or not be in such locked conditions. My parents had very different experiences. My mother worked in a couple of different places where she was locked up in a camp with guard dogs and SS guarding her. She's talked to us about those stories. Whereas my father was working on a farm, so he had a little bit more freedom. And so with everything that's happening in Ukraine and their parents, their stories and their difficult situation during the war, but then their liberation and life as refugees and finally making a home in the United States, I feel like with the war in Ukraine, so much of that is happening again today. We're hearing about internment camps, we're hearing about refugees. There's bombs everywhere. And I really wanted to write this book to shine a light on this time during World War II that feels like it's happening again. And it just feels eerily familiar. But at least to me, because I'm very close to the topic, but maybe not to everyone. And that's why I want to write this book, so that people realize that we're on the cusp of repeating history. We're very close to World War III, and we need to be careful about, this rise of fascism again, and kind of right-wing paramilitary that's happening in Europe and even potentially in our own country, and what we might do as humans if we're led by people like that again.
It's so interesting. We were talking a little bit before the show, and I admitted to you that I used to be a museum guide specializing in the Holocaust exhibit at the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles. And it was some of the most rewarding work that I've ever done. But what we talked about and what we taught were typically about the concentration camps.
Mhm.
In my mind, that is very similar to what I experience in the anti-trafficking movement. People only want to talk about sex trafficking, even though that's only 14% of the problem worldwide. The
Mhm.
biggest problem, again, is labor trafficking, slave
Mhm.
labor.
Right.
This is a major problem, but it doesn't sell the headlines. It's not got that same kind of shock factor. Do you feel like that's why a lot of people aren't really talking about the slave camps and stuff back then, and why they only want to discuss the Holocaust and the people that were dying in the death camps?
Yes, I do believe that that's part of the reason why it's such a small piece of history that's really discussed. I believe the other is because it impacted even more people. So I've read that about 13 million people in Europe were forced to go to Germany for work. That doesn't count the additional millions that were forced to work in the occupied territories. So just in
Wow.
Germany alone, there were 13 million people brought from Western Europe and Eastern Europe to come forcibly work to Germany, and they could have ended up in concentration camps. So I think one is the magnitude of the numbers and hard to get your head around them,
Yeah.
whereas, and then secondly, the magnitude of their experiences were definitely not, at the same level as concentration camp or death camp. And I think the third thing too is many of those who suffered either willingly or forcibly went back to Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union. And as many of us know, if we know our history, after World War II, that became an Iron Curtain. And there was very little communication between the West and the Eastern part of Europe and the Iron Curtain. And so I think we lost a lot of those stories too, because they were kind of squelched within Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. I've seen, I think, one book that's come out from Russia on the topic, but I'm even afraid to read it because it could be filled with mostly propaganda. I'm not sure even how true it can be or it would be. I know a few people who are starting to write about it, but I think it's because the people were, the majority of the people that were impacted by it the worst were stuck in the Soviet Union, so couldn't tell their stories as
Right.
maybe others could. And then I know for people like my parents and others who did make it to a free country like the United States, they just wanted to forget about it and keep their heads down. And they also felt like our story was bad, but we want to forget about it. We want to move on, and it's not as bad as the other stories. But I truly believe, Amanda, we need to tell the whole story. I mean, as you've talked about with trafficking, we need to talk about the whole trafficking story, not just the sex trafficking story. Like for this, we need to talk about the whole trauma that the Nazis inflicted, not just the Holocaust story.
Right. There was a famous dictator who once said that a single death was a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. It's the same
Mm-hmm.
thing with what it is that we're talking about today with this slave labor that was occurring back then. But we also have this problem that I think people are only now just starting to come around to understanding that traumas are not trophies. You cannot compare your experience to somebody else's experience. It doesn't matter if you survived or not, you have a story. It doesn't matter if you don't think your story is as bad as somebody else's. It has completely altered your life. Your story is important and needs to be heard. I think there's not a school child alive today that hasn't heard of the Diary of Anne Frank. We didn't get a diary from any of the slaves. We didn't get a diary from the Eastern Europeans who went through what your parents did. We didn't have that. So they became the statistic, whereas Anne Frank became the tragedy. That's got to change.
That's a really good point. Yeah. And I think it was Stalin who famously said that quote, or at least he's given credit for it, which is
Yes.
just an
Yeah.
atrocious quote by any magnitude. But I do agree. And I think what's interesting too is I've been talking with a lot of either young displaced persons that were born in the displaced person camps after the war, whose parents had similar experiences. And there is a real interest in starting to get those stories out more. And I've seen a lot of support for what I'm trying to do with just about everyone in the Ukrainian community that I speak with here in the US, whose parents or grandparents went through very similar situations. And they agree that the time is right for these stories to come out, so that we don't become statistics, or we don't become, completely lost history. And there's another really good reason for sharing this information now as well, especially with what's happening in Ukraine, is the propaganda that Putin and Russia is is filtering through our social media and through the media outlets, that somehow Ukraine is full of Nazis. And if more people understood the trauma that Ukrainians felt and experienced against the Nazis, not just the communists, then I think there would be a greater understanding of why there's only 1% of the Ukraine population that would consider themselves, that ultra right wing, is to be considered potentially a fascist or a Nazi, because many of them suffered under Nazis too. And so the propaganda is just propaganda. It's not real. And I want more of these stories to come out so people understand the history a little bit better and understand that there's really no reason for Ukraine to want to turn to Nazism. And it's not just because Zelensky is Jewish. There is a history and a real trauma there for them around this topic.
And speaking of these stories coming out, your book is hopefully coming out soon. I want to talk a little bit about just the title to begin with. Sunflowers bend but rarely break. And it's an absolutely gorgeous cover. It almost looks like a painting background with bright yellow sunflowers on it. And for people who aren't familiar with Simon Wiesenthal, he was one of the people who was going after Nazi war criminals.
Yes.
And he was an incredible person. And he wrote the book Sunflowers. And I was wanting to know if there was a tie-in between these two. Sunflowers are symbolic, right?
They absolutely are. So I hadn't thought of that connection, but I think that's another really good connection to the book. I chose this title for some different reasons. One is sunflower is the national flower of Ukraine. Secondly, sunflowers are the #1 agricultural export for Ukraine through sunflower oil. So it is a lifesaver for Ukraine before the war, as well as now during the war. And thirdly, when I read about sunflowers and how sunflowers can't, more than any other flower, reach for the sun, I just thought of them bending on very dark days. And I thought of my parents and anyone who was in a slave labor camp or in a concentration camp in Germany, how they had to change themselves and learn to take orders, learn to think of themselves as less than, make sure they didn't make eye contact, make sure that they never said the wrong thing, make sure they followed every order just to survive. But the people that came out of it, they bent, but they didn't break.
Your parents very much sound like sunflowers to me. I did a photo shoot in a sunflower field a couple of years ago. And one of the things that I learned when I was out there was as the sun moves across the sky, the reason they're called sunflowers is because they always face the sun. Right. They're always looking for that bright light. Yep. Yeah. Your parents sound like incredible people. They have to be proud of you for this. How's your family been with it?
Yeah, I think they would be. My parents passed away, so they've been passed now since the early 2000s. Right. And they were very private people and reserved people, as are the rest of my family. And so I think for them, they would have a little bit of heartache about it because of the privacy issue.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see that.
But I think knowing what it will do to help Ukraine, because I will be using some of the proceeds from this book to help the war and reconstruction and the refugee crisis in Ukraine. So it's not just about getting the word out in the education, but I think I believe they would like both. They would have liked both aspects of getting the word out and educating people, especially with what Vladimir Putin is saying about Ukraine. And then secondly, the help to Ukraine as a country as it rebuilds itself and the refugees, since they were refugees themselves. Everyone in my family has been extremely supportive. No one has said, don't do it. No one has said, don't share secrets or don't tell their story. This is really important to tell. So I'm I've had, and I have a lot of siblings, so they could have, differing views, but everyone is very supportive of this story getting out.
Oh, that's fantastic. My goodness.
Sure
And
is.
your parents passed in the early 2000s. They were born in the 20s. That would have made them in their 80s.
Yes. So my father was 79.
Okay.
He passed away in 2001, so just shy of 80, and my mother was 80 when she passed. She was a few years younger than he. Yeah.
So, with everything that they went through, they came over here and got reestablished in New York. But nobody at that time really even understood what PTSD was. This was something that was still referred to as shell shock if you were a soldier, or I don't remember some of the other terms, but PTSD really wasn't a term until the 1980s. And even when it became a term, it still wasn't something that was widely talked about or accepted. And
I
people
would agree.
thought, and some people still do, that PTSD is only something that a soldier will or can experience. But that's not true at all. Yeah. And I've heard it said most of my life, and I don't agree with it. I'll put that right out front. Hurt people hurt people. And that to me is a lie. Unhealed people hurt people. They don't do it intentionally. And there's plenty of people who do get hurt and they don't go out and physically hurt or mentally hurt other people.
I would agree
So
with that.
we have to kind of give grace to people that have been through stuff like this. Your childhood had to be rough because your parents went through a lot of stuff and probably weren't really taught how to cope with it.
I would agree with you, Amanda. They they came from a time when people didn't really talk about mental health or think about mental health. And if you even thought you had trouble with mental health, then the answer was an institution and you were crazy. I mean, that was what mental health was in the 30s and 40s. And so for my parents, I believe it was very much about just internalizing all of that and to squelching it. So they squelched it. And because they did that, it made them be very reserved people and not very emotional people, because I think they feared tapping into their emotion because then they might have to think back at what happened to them. And they had even some trauma before they ended up in slave labor camps. And unfortunately, too, with my father, you know, that led to a drinking problem, and he would lash out, both verbally and physically. So there definitely was some trauma growing up, because my parents weren't in a position to, in a time when people dealt with trauma and tried to heal themselves from trauma. I mean, they didn't even have the time to do it. They were just trying to survive, in a new country, that had taken them in. And, my father worked, 2, 3 jobs at a time all the time. And my mother had many mouths to feed and to take care of at home. So I think they didn't have time to think about it and to heal. And I think they did the best they could. And so, you also can get multi-generational trauma. And there's definitely some of that in my family because of, or I would say, all of us have been impacted by multi-generational trauma, if I want to be candid and honest. And, we all are dealing with it in different ways.
And I love that you are able to deal with it. Yeah. Did you find that writing this book and looking that much into your parents' past helped you to have more understanding for who they were?
Absolutely. I started that process in my early 20s because when I was young, I was very angry with them. I didn't get the physical abuse, but I got a little bit of the verbal from my father. And they were older and I was the youngest. And so they didn't give me very much attention. And that's what bothered me was kind of being forgotten. And so, in my early 20s, I decided to spend a lot of time with them. I knew they were getting old and I wanted to get to know them better. And I wanted to spend more time realizing where they came from and why they acted the way that they acted, and to be able to locate the triggers and be able to turn the trigger off when I found it. And I was able to do that quite well with both my parents. The harder nut to crack was my father, but when we did that, it made for a beautiful relationship up to his last days.
I hate that we're running out of time, um, but it has come to that time where I have to ask you my last question.
Sure.
And I've been considering actually starting a podcast all about people who are survivors or family members of survivors of World War II. And if I do start that, I would love to have you be my first guest.
I would love to come back and talk more about this.
Awesome. So, my very last question, it's always my favorite question. What is one thing that you love about yourself that's not related to your physical appearance?
What I would say that I would love about myself that I believe more people could do in this world is to listen more before we speak and to try to understand other people, before we make decisions about people or have opinions about people. And I think in today's world, we all are a little bit too quick to judge. And I try not to do that.
Now, your book, Sunflowers Bend But Rarely Break, you do have a website for this so people can follow along with all release dates and news and excitement stuff. That's sunflowersrarelybreak.com. You also have an Instagram page, a LinkedIn page, a Facebook page. You've got all kinds of stuff. I'm going to make sure I have all of these links in the episode description. But this has been such a wonderful conversation with you, Oksana. I cannot thank you enough for joining me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for having me. I really appreciate being here and knowing a little bit more about your story. I'm really grateful that you had me and that we have this World War II connection.
If you've enjoyed tonight's episode, please make sure you check out the episode description. You'll find links there on how you can learn more about this guest, links to connect with them on social media, and how to support the podcast. Remember, I don't get paid to do this. My boss is a bit tight-fisted, but I can say that. I work for myself.